I don't know if I'm overreacting here, but I need some outside perspective because my family is kind of a mess right now. For context, I'm 23, and I have a younger brother, Sam, who's 16. Sam has high-functioning autism, and honestly, I love him, but growing up with him hasn't been easy. My parents, John and Linda, have always treated him with kid gloves. Ever since his diagnosis, they've gone out of their way to make sure his life is easy. But somewhere along the way, that morphed into giving him whatever he wants whenever he wants it. I get that parenting a kid with autism can be tough, and I try to be understanding, but Sam isn't just accommodated, he's spoiled rotten. He's demanding, entitled, and manipulative, and my parents have let him get away with it for years. For instance, every holiday has to revolve around him. Birthdays? Forget it. Even when it's my birthday, Sam throws a fit unless everything is about him. He's ruined so many celebrations that I stopped bothering to care about them at all. One Christmas, I saved up and bought myself a new gaming console. I was so proud because it took months of part-time work to afford it. Sam decided he wanted it, and when I wouldn't give it to him, he cried until my parents made me let him borrow it. Spoiler alert, I never got it back. I tried to bring it up, but my parents always hit me with the same lines. Sam can't help it, or, he's been through so much. Things hit a boiling point recently. I just graduated college and started my first real job. I've been saving for months because I wanted to treat myself to something nice. A trip abroad. I booked the tickets, paid for everything, and couldn't stop talking about it. The trip was supposed to be next month, but when Sam found out, he got upset. He said it wasn't fair I was going somewhere cool when he couldn't go. I told him it wasn't a big deal and suggested we plan a family trip for later, but that wasn't enough for him. Sam started whining about how he wanted to go instead, and next thing I knew, my parents were telling me I should cancel my trip and let him have it. At first, I thought they were joking, but nope. They were dead serious. They told me it was selfish to spend all that money on myself when I could make Sam happy. I refused. For the first time, I flat out said no. The fallout was ridiculous. Sam cried for hours and refused to eat. My parents kept pressuring me, saying I didn't understand how hard life is for him and that I was being cruel. I told them I've been bending over backward for Sam my whole life, and this was the one thing I wasn't going to budge on. Now, my parents are furious with me. They say I'm being unreasonable and setting a bad example for Sam. Meanwhile, Sam keeps giving me the silent treatment, which honestly feels like a blessing. But part of me wonders if I'm in the wrong. Should I have just given in to keep the peace? Or am I right to finally stand up for myself? I'd love to hear what you all think. Looking back, I think the first time I realized just how far my parents would go to appease Sam was on my 21st birthday. Turning 21 is supposed to be a big deal, right? It's one of those milestone birthdays where you're finally an adult, legally able to drink, and it's your moment to celebrate. I wasn't planning anything wild, just a small party at home with close friends and family. I was actually excited about it. For once, I thought maybe it could be about me. I even convinced myself that Sam would behave since I kept it low-key. But, of course, I was wrong. The moment Sam found out about the party, he threw one of his infamous fits. He screamed that it wasn't fair and said he hated the idea of people coming over just for me. I overheard him telling Mom, "If they come, I'm not going to talk to anyone. I'll stay in my room and ruin everything." The next day, my parents sat me down with their concerned faces. They explained that the party wasn't a good idea because it might upset Sam. They tried to spin it like they were doing me a favor, saying it would be less stressful for everyone if we just skipped it. I was stunned. It was my 21st birthday. I argued, begged, and tried to reason with them, but they wouldn't budge. They even made me cancel the invitations I'd already sent out. That was the first time I didn't just accept their decision. I told my friends what happened, and honestly, they were angrier than I was. Word spread fast, and soon my teachers and even my school counselor found out. People started asking questions, some directly to my parents. My counselor actually called them to express concern about how this was affecting me. I think they were embarrassed, which was a small win for me at the time, but they didn't change their stance. Instead, my parents doubled down, accusing me of being selfish for airing our family's dirty laundry. They said I was just trying to make them look bad. But the truth was, I didn't even have to try. Their choices spoke for themselves. I spent my 21st birthday alone in my room, watching movies and eating pizza I ordered for myself. Meanwhile, Sam was downstairs playing video games on the console I'd bought for myself years ago. The party wasn't the point, it was the principle. My parents couldn't see past Sam's wants long enough to give me a single moment to feel celebrated. Even now, years later, that birthday sticks with me. It was one of the first times I realized just how much of my life had been shaped around avoiding Sam's tantrums. It's exhausting to feel like you don't matter in your own family. A few weeks after my 21st birthday disaster, something unexpected happened. I think the backlash from my friends, teachers, and counselor finally got to my parents. They were always so obsessed with maintaining this image of being the perfect family. And the fact that people outside our bubble were questioning their choices must have been a wake-up call. One evening, out of nowhere, my mom told me we were going out to dinner as a family to make up for my missed birthday. I didn't buy it. My parents never apologized for anything when it came to Sam, and the idea of them doing something nice for me without some ulterior motive felt off. But I went along with it because, honestly, what else was I supposed to do? When we arrived at the restaurant, a big arcade-style place filled with games, neon lights, and loud music, I was genuinely confused. Then I walked into a private party room, and there they were. My friends, some extended family, and even a few coworkers from my part-time job. I was stunned. My parents had actually thrown me a surprise party. At first, I didn't know how to react. I was happy, of course, but also suspicious. Why now? Why here? And more importantly, where was Sam? It didn't take long to find out. About 20 minutes into the party, Sam stormed into the room. I could tell by the look on his face that he wasn't happy. He barely looked at me, didn't say hello to anyone, and immediately sat down in a corner with his arms crossed. I tried to ignore him and focus on my friends, but then the cake came out. It was this ridiculous, over-the-top, multi-tiered cake with candles and decorations. Everyone started singing Happy Birthday, and for a moment, I actually felt like things were normal. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw Sam get up from his seat. At first, I thought he was going to walk out, but instead, he headed straight for the cake table. Before I could react, he grabbed the edge of the table and started to tip it. My heart sank. I braced myself for the usual outcome. My parents swooping in to coddle him while I watched everything fall apart. But something different happened this time. My dad grabbed Sam's arm and pulled him away. "Enough, Sam," he said, louder than I'd ever heard him speak to Sam before. My mom stepped in too, physically blocking him from the table. For the first time ever, they actually stopped him from ruining something for me. Sam started screaming and crying, yelling about how it wasn't fair, how he hated this party, and how no one cared about him. But my parents didn't cave. They escorted him out of the room, and for the rest of the night, they kept him occupied in another part of the arcade. The party wasn't perfect. How could it be with all that drama? But it was the first time I felt like my parents were trying to stand up for me. It wasn't a full victory, but it was a start. For the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they were starting to realize how much they'd let things spiral out of control. Of course, I wasn't holding my breath for any long-term changes. One party wasn't going to undo years of favoritism. But in that moment, I allowed myself to enjoy it. It felt good to be surrounded by people who cared about me, even if the celebration came with a side of chaos. When I was 19, I made the decision to move out of my parents' house. It wasn't a sudden thing. I'd been planning it for months. I couldn't live under the same roof as Sam anymore. His constant demands, the chaos he brought to every moment, and my parents' unwavering devotion to keeping him happy at the expense of everyone else had worn me down. I needed space, freedom, and a chance to finally live my own life. I saved every penny from my part-time jobs and lined up a small, crappy apartment that I could just barely afford. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I thought my parents might be a little supportive or at least understanding, but when I told them my plan, the response was underwhelming. My mom got misty-eyed, saying she didn't know how they'd manage without me. My dad just looked worried and asked, "But what about Sam? That was the real issue, wasn't it? It always came back to Sam. My parents had leaned on me for years to help handle him, even though I was just a kid myself. I knew leaving would make their lives harder, but I couldn't let that keep me trapped anymore. I reassured them as best as I could, saying I'd still visit and help when I could. But inside, I was counting the days until I could leave. The day I moved out was chaos. I had a friend with a truck come help me load my stuff, and Sam was lurking around the whole time, sulking. At first, he just sat on the stairs, glaring at me. But when he saw me packing my TV and gaming setup, he snapped. "That's mine!" he screamed, pointing at the TV I'd bought with my own money. "You can't take it." I ignored him and kept packing, but he ran to our mom, tears streaming down his face. "Michael's stealing my stuff," he wailed. Of course, my mom rushed in, trying to mediate. "Michael, do you really need to take the TV?" she asked, like I was being unreasonable. "It's mine, Mom. I bought it. I'm not leaving it here so Sam can destroy it like he did with everything else I've ever owned." That didn't go over well. Sam started screaming, and when my mom couldn't calm him down, he lashed out. He kicked over a stack of boxes, spilling my things all over the floor. He even grabbed one of my video games and snapped the disc in half. I was furious, but I bit my tongue. I didn't want my last moments in that house to turn into a full-blown fight. By the time I finally got out of there, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in years. My apartment wasn't much. A tiny studio with peeling paint and a leaky faucet, but it was mine. For the first time, I didn't have to tiptoe around someone else's moods. I didn't have to give up my stuff or sacrifice my plans for Sam. It was liberating. But, of course, the chaos didn't stop just because I wasn't living at home anymore. I still visited for holidays and birthdays, which were always a nightmare. The worst was Sam's 17th birthday. By then, he'd gotten even more demanding, if that was even possible. He'd decided he wanted a PlayStation 6, which had just come out and was nearly impossible to find. Even if you could get your hands on one, it cost an arm and a leg. My parents tried to reason with him, saying it was too expensive and maybe he could wait until prices went down. But Sam wasn't having it. "It's my birthday," he shouted. "You have to get it for me." My parents, as always, bent over backward trying to please him. They called every store, searched online, and even considered paying a ridiculous markup to buy one from a reseller. But it didn't matter what they did. By the time his birthday rolled around, they hadn't been able to find one. When Sam realized he wasn't getting the PlayStation, he completely lost it. I wasn't there to witness the meltdown, but I heard about it later from my dad, who called me in a panic. "He smashed the coffee table," my dad said, his voice shaking, "and the TV stand. He threw a chair through the patio door." I was stunned, but not entirely surprised. Sam's tantrums had always been destructive, but this was on another level. The damage ended up costing my parents over $3,000. And the worst part? They didn't even seem angry at him. My mom excused it by saying, "He was just so disappointed. He doesn't know how to handle big emotions." I wanted to scream. How could they keep enabling him like this? How could they keep sacrificing their time, money, and sanity just to avoid upsetting him? And how could they expect me to keep coming back to this madhouse like nothing was wrong? That incident was a turning point for me. It made me realize that no matter how much space I put between myself and my family, the weight of Sam's behavior would always linger. My parents would always expect me to come back and help pick up the pieces, even when the mess wasn't mine to begin with. For the first time, I started to wonder if keeping my distance wasn't just about protecting myself. It might be the only way to show my parents that they couldn't keep enabling Sam forever. But even as I pulled back, I couldn't help feeling guilty. They were still my family, after all. I just didn't know how much longer I could keep playing the role they wanted me to. A few weeks after Sam's 17th birthday meltdown, my dad called me with an update that honestly shocked me. I wasn't expecting much to change after Sam trashed half the house. My parents always found some way to excuse his behavior or sweep the consequences under the rug. But this time, they actually did something different, something drastic. "We sold his stuff," my dad said bluntly over the phone. I nearly dropped my coffee. "Wait, what? What do you mean you sold his stuff?" "To cover the damage," he explained. The patio door, the furniture, the TV stand, it cost us thousands to replace everything. Your mom and I agreed it wasn't fair to keep paying for his tantrums while he gets to sit around with all these luxuries. So, we sold his consoles, his gaming computer, and, well, most of his things. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what I just heard. For years, my parents had bent over backward to keep Sam happy. They let him get away with so much because they were terrified of his outbursts. And now, for the first time, they were holding him accountable. It wasn't just the gaming stuff either. My dad said they'd sold his bikes, his VR headset, and even some furniture from his room. When Sam came home and found his space practically empty, he flipped. He was furious, Dad admitted. At first, he screamed at us. But we told him this was the consequence of his actions. If he wants nice things, he has to learn to take care of them, and us couldn't believe it. For the first time ever, they weren't making excuses or tiptoeing around him. They were standing their ground, even as Sam's meltdown dragged on for days. He refused to eat dinner with them, locked himself in his room, and alternated between sulking and yelling. But then, something unexpected happened. Sam started to calm down. I didn't witness it firsthand, but my dad told me about the shift. He's quieter, he said almost cautiously. I think he's actually thinking about what he did. According to my dad, without his gadgets to distract him, Sam had no choice but to sit with his emotions. He apologized to my mom a few days later, though he stopped short of apologizing to my dad or me. Still, it was a start. When I visited a couple of weeks later, the house felt different. Sam was still moody, but there was a new air of restraint in his behavior. He didn't lash out at me when I refused to give him my phone to play with, and when my parents asked him to clear the table after dinner, he did it without arguing. It wasn't a complete transformation. He was still Sam after all. But for the first time, I saw a glimmer of something I never thought possible. Self-awareness. I think losing all his stuff forced him to realize that his actions had real consequences, and no tantrum could bring his things back. I don't want to give my parents too much credit. They're still far from perfect, and they have a long way to go when it comes to setting boundaries with Sam. But this was the first time they truly followed through on a punishment, and it seemed to make a difference. For me, it was bittersweet. On one hand, I was glad they were finally standing up to Sam and making him take responsibility. On the other hand, I couldn't help but wonder why it had taken so long. Was it really the $3,000 in damages that pushed them over the edge? Or had they finally started to see what I'd been saying for years? Whatever the reason, I hoped this was the beginning of real change. But knowing my family, I wasn't holding my breath. About a month after the whole ordeal with Sam's stuff being sold, my parents called me to say they wanted to make things right. I wasn't sure what that even meant anymore, but I agreed to meet at their house for a family dinner. When I showed up, it wasn't just us. There were several extended family members and even a couple of close family friends sitting in the living room. I immediately knew something was up. The mood was tense but purposeful. My aunt, who's never been shy about speaking her mind, was the first to break the silence. "We're here because this has gone on long enough," she said, looking directly at my parents. "It's not just Michael who's been hurt by this. It's all of us. And it's time we talk about it." That's when I realized this wasn't just a family dinner. It was an intervention. Over the next hour, people took turns sharing stories about how Sam's behavior and my parents' enabling had affected them. My cousins talked about holidays ruined by Sam's tantrums. A family friend brought up how my parents had once canceled a barbecue because Sam didn't feel like sharing the backyard. Even my grandmother, who rarely gets involved in conflicts, said she felt like she couldn't visit anymore because Sam made her so uncomfortable. And then it was my turn. I didn't hold back. I talked about the countless birthdays and holidays Sam had ruined, how my belongings were taken from me, and how I'd felt like an afterthought in my own family for years. I told them how isolating it had been to grow up in a house where everything revolved around one person, and how moving out was the only way I could reclaim any sense of autonomy. To my surprise, my parents didn't get defensive. My mom looked like she was on the verge of tears the entire time, and my dad just sat there, nodding solemnly. When everyone was done, my dad finally spoke. "We've made a lot of mistakes," he said, his voice heavy. We thought we were doing what was best for Sam, but we see now that we've been unfair to everyone else. Especially you, Michael. We're sorry." Hearing those words felt surreal. For years, I'd wanted them to acknowledge the damage their choices had caused, but I'd never expected it to actually happen. My mom chimed in, apologizing for not standing up for me more and for letting Sam's needs overshadow mine. It wasn't a perfect apology. They still framed a lot of it around their intentions rather than the outcomes, but it was more than I ever thought I'd get. Sam, on the other hand, was a different story. He'd been sitting on the couch, arms crossed, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the conversation went on. When it became clear that this intervention was as much about him as it was about my parents, he snapped. "This is stupid," he yelled, jumping up from his seat. "You're all ganging up on me. I didn't do anything wrong." My aunt tried to calm him down, but he wasn't having it. He started pacing the room, yelling about how unfair this was, and at one point, he even dropped to the floor, pretending to have some kind of attack. It was honestly embarrassing to watch, but no one caved. Instead, my dad did something I never thought I'd see. He knelt down next to Sam and said, "Sam, stop. This isn't helping. We're not doing this anymore." Sam looked up at him, stunned. For the first time, my dad wasn't placating him. He wasn't rushing to soothe or fix things. He was setting a boundary. At first, Sam kept protesting, but when he realized no one was going to give him the reaction he wanted, he eventually stopped. He sat back down, arms crossed, glaring at everyone. But then, something unexpected happened. My grandmother, who hadn't spoken much during the intervention, leaned forward and said, "Sam, we love you, but you have to understand that your actions have consequences. You've hurt a lot of people, and it's time to take responsibility for that." There was a long silence. For a moment, I thought Sam was going to lash out again. But instead, he looked down at his hands, his face turning red. I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he mumbled, barely audible. "It wasn't much, but it was something." The intervention ended on a cautiously hopeful note. My parents promised to start setting boundaries with Sam and to stop letting him dictate everything. They even said they were considering family therapy, which I thought was long overdue. As for Sam, he didn't exactly apologize to me or anyone else that night, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. In the weeks that followed, there were small but noticeable changes. My parents started holding Sam accountable for his behavior, even if it meant dealing with his tantrums. He still had his moments, but I could tell he was starting to realize that he couldn't just bulldoze his way through life anymore. I don't know if things will ever be perfect. Family dynamics like ours don't change overnight, but for the first time in years, I feel like there's a real chance for things to get better. And that's more than I ever thought I'd have. Things seemed to be improving for a while after the intervention. My parents were actually trying to enforce boundaries, and Sam was slowly starting to adjust to the idea that he couldn't always get his way. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension and old habits die hard, but I had hoped that we were finally moving in the right direction. But then, everything came crashing down. I got a frantic call from my dad one afternoon. His voice was shaking as he said, "Michael, it's your mom. She's in the hospital." My stomach dropped. He didn't give me many details over the phone, just that I needed to come as soon as I could. When I got to the hospital, I found my dad sitting in the waiting room, looking older and more exhausted than I'd ever seen him. "What happened?" I asked, bracing myself for the answer. He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "It's Linda. She's been struggling for a while, but I didn't realize how bad it had gotten." Over the next hour, he filled me in on what had led up to this moment. Apparently, my mom had been secretly letting Sam use a new gaming console and laptop, even though they'd agreed as a family not to replace the items they sold after his meltdown. My dad had no idea, but my mom had been sneaking the devices to Sam whenever my dad wasn't around, hoping it would keep him calm and prevent another tantrum. First, it worked. Sam was thrilled to have his games and gadgets back, and for a few weeks, things were relatively peaceful. But then Sam started pushing for more. He wanted additional games, accessories, and upgrades, and when my mom told him no, he went into one of his usual tantrums. This time, though, something in my mom snapped. She was already under so much pressure from everything that had happened. The intervention, the constant strain of managing Sam's behavior, and the guilt of realizing how much she'd hurt me and others over the years. When Sam started yelling and demanding more, she lost control. She hit him, my dad said quietly, his voice full of regret. She's never done that before. Not even close. But she slapped him across the face, and I think it scared both of them. Sam was shocked. My mom broke down immediately afterward, apologizing and crying. But the damage was done. My dad said she spiraled after that, retreating to their bedroom and barely speaking to anyone for days. Then, a few nights later, she self-harmed. My dad found her in the bathroom and rushed her to the hospital. Hearing all of this was like a punch to the gut. I felt angry, sad, and overwhelmed all at once. Angry at my mom for giving in to Sam again, angry at Sam for pushing her to the brink, and angry at my dad for not seeing how bad things had gotten. But more than anything, I felt heartbroken. When I finally saw my mom, she looked fragile. She was pale, with dark circles under her eyes, and she wouldn't meet my gaze. I sat with her for a while, not really knowing what to say. "I'm sorry," she whispered eventually, her voice barely audible. "For everything. For how I treated you. For how I let this family fall apart." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to forgive her, but another part of me was still holding on to years of resentment. All I could do in that moment was squeeze her hand and tell her I loved her. As for Sam, he was visibly shaken by what happened. For the first time in his life, he seemed to grasp the weight of his actions. He didn't throw a tantrum or demand anything. He just sat in the hospital waiting room, quiet and subdued. When I talked to him later, he actually apologized. "I didn't mean to make her so upset," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't know." It wasn't much, but it was the first real sign of remorse I'd ever seen from him. Maybe seeing the consequences of his behavior play out in such a raw and personal way finally got through to him. After my mom was discharged, my parents decided to start family therapy. It was something they'd talked about before but never followed through on. This time, they were serious. My mom needed help to work through her depression and guilt. My dad needed to learn how to support her better, and Sam needed to understand that the world didn't revolve around him. It's been a long road since then, and we're all still healing in our own ways. My mom is doing better now, but she's still fragile. Sam is slowly learning to manage his emotions and respect boundaries, though it's not an overnight process. And me? I'm trying to let go of the anger and hurt I've carried for so long. We're far from perfect, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like there's a chance for us to move forward. Not as the fractured, chaotic family we've been, but as something healthier. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm cautiously optimistic. That's more than I ever thought I'd say. The weeks following the hospital incident with my mom were tense but different. For the first time in years, it felt like my parents were genuinely committed to change. My dad, in particular, took the lead in setting boundaries and enforcing rules with Sam, something he'd never really done before. One of the first things he did was strip Sam's room of all the luxuries he used to have. My dad let him keep a basic setup, an old Nintendo 64 console and a small folding stool he could use while playing. That was it. No gaming computer, no fancy accessories, no modern consoles. Sam wasn't thrilled about it, of course, but my dad didn't budge. "You've got to earn back our trust, Sam," my dad told him firmly. "If you want more privileges, you need to prove you can handle responsibility." I was surprised by how serious my dad was about sticking to his guns. He started holding Sam accountable for basic things, like doing his share of household chores, managing his schoolwork, and treating everyone in the house with respect. At first, Sam protested, but without his usual gadgets to distract him, he didn't have much of an escape. Gradually, he began to comply. I decided to visit more often during this time. I wasn't sure what to expect from Sam, but I wanted to help him adapt. I knew he'd struggle with all the changes, and part of me hoped I could guide him through it while reinforcing the boundaries my parents were trying to establish. On one of my visits, I found him sitting on his folding stool, staring at the screen as Mario jumped across pixelated platforms. It was a stark contrast to the elaborate gaming setups he'd had in the past. "Hey," I said, sitting down on the bed. How's it going? He shrugged, not taking his eyes off the screen. It's fine, I guess. This game's old. It's a classic, I said with a small smile. You might even learn to like it. He paused the game and turned to me, frowning. Do you think they're ever gonna let me have my stuff back? I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. I think it depends on you, Sam. It's not about what they let you have, it's about what you show them. If you prove you can handle responsibility, they'll probably trust you with more. But it's not gonna happen overnight. He looked down at his hands, picking at his fingers. I don't know how to do that. I don't even know how to be like normal. That hit me harder than I expected. For all his tantrums and manipulative behavior over the years, it was easy to forget that underneath it all, he was still a kid who'd never really learned how to navigate life. Nobody knows how to be an adult at first, I told him honestly. It's something you figure out as you go. But the first step is taking responsibility for yourself. Doing things because they need to be done, not because someone's forcing you. That's what being an adult is about. He nodded slowly, but I could tell he was still processing it. Over the next few visits, I noticed small but significant changes. Sam started helping with chores without being asked, even doing things like vacuuming and loading the dishwasher on his own. He wasn't perfect. There were still moments of frustration and resistance, but he was trying. One evening, while we were sitting at the dining table, I asked him how he was feeling about everything. I don't know, he admitted. It's weird. I kind of miss how things used to be, when I didn't have to worry about stuff and everyone just did things for me. That's not how the real world works, I said gently. And deep down, I think you know that. He nodded again, staring down at the table. Yeah, I just don't know how to do it all. It's hard. It is hard, I agreed. But it gets easier the more you do it. And you don't have to figure it out alone. Mom and Dad are trying to help, and so am I. But you've got to meet us halfway. Okay? Okay, he said softly. That moment felt like a turning point. For years, I'd seen Sam as this spoiled, demanding kid who only cared about himself. But now I was starting to see someone who wanted to change. Someone who was scared and unsure of how to grow up, but willing to try. There's still a long road ahead for all of us. My parents are learning how to enforce boundaries without breaking under pressure. Sam is learning what it means to take responsibility, and I'm learning how to let go of the resentment I've carried for so long. It's not perfect, and it might never be. But for the first time, it feels like we're all moving in the right direction. And for now, that's enough.